Okay, we're going to talk about microevolution. What microevolution is looking at the evolution or the change in a population. That is, we're looking at things on a small scale and trying to discover or trying to figure out like what kinds of things would actually cause the evolutionary process. And these two mathematicians, Hardy and Weinberg, came up with an equation. This is really not a new equation. It's called a quadratic equation. You might have seen it if you've taken stats before because they use it to predict the probability of having, if you had two coins, of having two heads, a head and a tail, or two tails. And the probability would be, 50% for each one. And anyway, if you might have seen this equation before. So what they did was they applied this same idea to alleles. That is, you have the possibility of two alleles, and they can either come up together like two heads. So you could have two P's, say, for example, or they could come up together in the other form. You could have two Q's, so let's say dominant and recessive, or you could have the heterozygotes. All right, so this equation is representing the probability that those things would occur. Now, what it actually does, if you want to read through the math and so forth in the textbook, what it's predicting is if there is no changes in the population, then if you start with a certain allele frequency, then it will always stay that same allele frequency over time. In other words, if I started with, say, 60% P and 40% Q, after the next generation, it would still be that. And the second generation, it would still be that, etc. over time, as long as these assumptions are met, right? So the assumptions here, that what they're getting at here is that this is no evolution, right? No changes in the population. No changes that would cause an evolutionary process. So these assumptions are that, number one, no genetic mutations. Number two, no gene flow or net immigration. The population size is large, mating is random, and all individuals survive and reproduce. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through each one of these and talk about the likelihood that that's occurring, number one, and number two, the kinds of things that could cause change or therefore could lead to an evolutionary change in a population. All right, so the first one is genetic mutations. So if we look at this, you can see that mutations are mostly not inheritable. That is, things like, mostly it's happening in places where mitosis is happening a lot, exposure to radiation, that kind of thing. So, your skin has more mutations than probably any place else on your body. And if you look at somebody who's older like me, there's lots of little blips in your skin, right? And those are just mutations to those cells. However, I would not pass those on to my offspring. So the thing that would be important in terms of evolutionary change is they have to be inheritable mutations. So things that could be passed on. And not all mutations are good. If they're bad, let's say, for example, they cause an individual not to be able to produce the protein and digest food, and therefore they're not doing well in their environment, then that mutation is likely to not stay in the population. If it's neutral, let's say it doesn't matter at all, for example, different hair colors, let's say you have dark or almost black hair, and you got a mutation that caused brown hair, and that still didn't make you stand out in the environment or make any kind of change in your sexual reproduction, then that would be what they call a neutral mutation, and it could stay in the population but not necessarily lead to an evolution. And the ones that are most likely to lead to evolutionary process are ones that are beneficial. For example, maybe digesting a protein that you couldn't digest before would allow you to eat a food source that is abundant, and other species that are closely related to you or other individuals in your population can't digest. Therefore, you do better and you pass that gene on to your offspring. So mutation is a possible place for an evolutionary process, but it has to be generally speaking, a beneficial mutation. Okay, the second one is what if no gene flow or no net immigration? All right, so what immigration is, of course, is moving from one population to another. Emigration is moving out of the population. So you always have immigration in one and emigration in the other. And what this could do, it could change the allele frequency. In some cases, that would not be, anything. It would just be sort of making the allele frequency a little bit different, but not really lead to an evolutionary change. But a possible change could happen. Let's say, for example, if you had a phenotype that was all one type, and a neighboring phenotype of a similar or the same species, but it had a phenotype of all another type. If you had immigration into that population, then what would happen is you then would have allele mixes, and this could then cause an evolutionary change in that population. All right, so that it's possible, not always happening. All right. The third one is population sizes are large. So what this is related to is the laws of probability. The laws of probability mean that you have to have enough alleles for this, throwing of the coin, so to speak, to come out with the quadratic equation. So again, remember this is based on probability. So like with the coins, you would have 50% probability of being one or the other, and if you had a smaller population, sometimes that will change the allele frequency in the population and make us recessive alleles more common. So recessive alleles being more common can lead to like genetic problems in a small population. All right, this is called genetic drift. There are two types. One is called population bottleneck. This is where the population size is reduced. So this would be like an endangered species or something where that species is reduced down to a very small number, and then reproductive efforts are all coming from just a few individuals. This, of course, could lead to some inherent recessive allele problems. Another one is the founder effect. This is where a population breaks off from another population, like going to an island. This is, put in quotes, but let's say, for example, like the Amish in the United States. So they are reproductively isolated because they are a small community based on religion and so forth, and they will have their alleles spread amongst themselves, a very small community, so things might show up. An example of something that has in their community is six-fingeredness. Another one is Tay-Sachs disease, which Tay-Sachs disease is from Eastern European Jewish populations where they were sequestered and kept apart from the other population, and then they developed or had this disease more frequent in their group. All right, so those are two things where the genetic population is small. All right, so the next one is mating is random. So this doesn't mean that if you're going around and mating randomly with just anybody, you can still have a partner or whatever. What it means is you're not choosing based on some phenotype or even some genotype. Obviously, this is about like the outward expression is the phenotype. So mating, of course, would mostly be based on that. So if that were the case, this would be sexual selection. Usually it's the female that is choosing the male based on some phenotypic like selection. And a lot of times in species that do this, there's what we call sexual dimorphism, where the males are, sometimes larger, or they are more colorful, or they're, in some way they are showy, so that they're trying to attract the best female. All right. So an example of this is cardinals. The male is the really bright red one, and the female is the more drab one. Usually in cardinals, she's a little bit larger. She's protecting the nest, and she's drab, so she blends in. And he is trying to attract her. Now, in this case, in sexual selection, the brightest cardinal and the largest female are likely to be the main mating pair, and they may in fact have more than one clutch or more than one nesting time during a season. And then there's a hierarchy down from there where the cardinals that are doing the least well in their environment are the least likely to be chosen as a mate, and in fact may not even mate that year, or if they mate, they may only have one clutch. So this in a way could cause a evolutionary change favoring the best, brightest, biggest cardinals, right? So that would be sexual selection. It's in a lot of birds, by the way. Okay, and then the last one is all members survive and reproduce. And of course, this is what Darwin was saying, was that in most populations, this is not true. This is why natural selection is considered one of the main ways that populations evolve, because almost no population, all members survive and reproduce. So let's go over the different types of natural selection. The one that most people usually think of is the one that we call directional. What this means is, let's say this is representing phenotypes down here. So they have in your book, they have like dark, medium, and light moths as an example. You could think of, maybe dominant allele, recessive allele, heterozygous, co-dominant possibly situation in this case. And what is happening is one extreme phenotype will be eliminated, and what that does is it pushes the population into the other groups. In other words, the population will become more of the middle and the light phenotype, and the dark ones would be eliminated for some reason. Perhaps they got picked off by a predator or something like that. All right, so that's directional. Another example of that is pesticide resistance in, say, roaches, where you use a certain pesticide, it's getting rid of all the ones that are affected by the pesticide, pushing the population to a group that is unaffected by the pesticide, and therefore the pesticide no longer works, and you have to use a different one. All right, so that's an example. Antibiotic resistance is another. All right, another one is stabilizing. What this is both extreme phenotypes are eliminated, and that means that the concentration of the population phenotype is around this middle group. All right, so this would be that both endpoints of the population get picked off for some reason, and that middle group is then favored, even though sometimes it might not seem like it should be favored. All right, so anyway, that's an example of that. All right, disruptive is another type. Disruptive is where the middle phenotype is eliminated and the extremes are favored. An example of this is like there's a snail that lives in streams, and they can crawl out on the rocks. So the rocks that are next to the stream are kind of darkened by the water splashing on them, and the rocks that are under the water are a little bit lighter, are a little bit, I said that wrong. The ones in the water are darker, and the ones out of the water are lighter. And what happens is that middle phenotype stands out in both locations. So the endpoints are favored because they're either blending in with under the water or out of the water, and the middle ones are just taken out of the population. So you tend to have then a dimorphic population.